In 2022, when Russia started their full-scale invasion of Ukraine, they had a population of approximately 7 million young men in their 20s. Now, just a little over 3 years later, that population has been reduced to approximately 6 million young men in their 20s, a reduction of over 1 million men in just 3 years, or a 15% drop from a number that was already drastically too small. These men have been lost for a variety of reasons. Obviously, many were lost to the war itself. Others simply fled the country to avoid being lost in the war. But in either case, Russia has lost a huge portion of the young men they need to run their economy for the foreseeable future, which will create problems for them that will extend far beyond the end of the war itself. This isn't a new problem for Russia. Instead, it's an existing problem that is now getting pushed over the edge because of the war. Even prior to their full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia already desperately needed more young men. The country is plagued by a low birth rate, a high death rate, and negative net migration. So Russia's population has been shrinking at an increasingly catastrophic rate for a long time. In fact, Russia's total population is now expected to drop from approximately 144 million people today to just around 120 million people by the year 2050. That's a loss of 24 million, or a population reduction only slightly smaller than the number of people the entire Soviet Union lost during World War II. And this current population collapse estimate isn't even counting potential Russian losses from future catastrophic wars. Simply put, Russia is running out of Russians. And when examining this situation carefully, many sociologists have noted that Russia may completely lose their ability to conduct offensive military operations within 6 to 10 years. That's because the population losses are especially noticeable among the younger generations of Russians. And it's no secret at this point that one of Russia's preferred military strategies is to send large waves of under-equipped men to rush objectives against opponents that are technologically superior. The idea is that if they don't care how many men they lose, Russia can eventually overwhelm their opponents by sheer numbers alone. But military strategies that are dependent upon sheer numbers won't exactly work as Russia's population continues to run low. And as Russia continues to run out of Russians, even this strategy will become increasingly untenable, giving Russia no real hope of future successful conquests. This could be a reason why Russia is doubling down on their invasion of Ukraine today, and is refusing to quit their offensives even as they face extremely heavy losses, and even as most analysts conclude that Russia cannot effectively win the war. Doing the math, Russian leadership may have concluded that it's now or never, and that they need to push forward and use what young men they have left to lock in whatever wins they can, no matter how small and no matter how high the cost. Because from the crude, cynical math of a dictator, whether you lose a young man on the battlefield, or whether you lose them due to the simple fact that they were never born in the first place, the outcome for you is exactly the same. Just one less person in your population whose life you can use for your own purposes. In this case, for the purpose of conquering your neighbor's land. But we've just scratched the surface of Russia's population collapse problem, which goes far deeper than you might even think. So, let's take a look. But first, this video was made possible by our sponsor, Incogn. If you ever Google yourself, you might be shocked to see how easy it is for people to find your personal details that you would never intentionally share with a stranger. For most of us, someone who simply knows our name, city, and state can easily pull up our private information in minutes or even seconds, including some of our most sensitive details like our home address. This was something that was concerning to me as a YouTuber who makes videos that give many bad people a vested interest in doing not such nice things to me. But thankfully, today's sponsor, Incogn, can help. Incogn helps address one of the main reasons your data is so available all over the internet, which is data brokers, who collect and sell your personal details for a profit. Incogn makes it easy to remove your personal data from hundreds of these data broker websites, a process that might otherwise take you several hundred hours to complete. Then, Incogn helps monitor those websites to ensure your data doesn't come back. All you have to do is sign up, give Incogn permission to act on your behalf, and they get to work, finding, flagging, and demanding that your information be deleted. And while the majority of websites can be caught by Incogni's efficient and automated removal service, Incogn also recently introduced Incogn Unlimited, which takes your data privacy even further by giving you unlimited access to submit links to specific websites to Incogni's privacy experts for removal, with most sites being eligible. If you're ready to reclaim your privacy, now's the time. Use the link in the description and my code Icarus to get a massive 60% discount on your subscription. Thanks to Incogn for sponsoring today's video. World War II had many devastating effects on Russia, which continue to plague Russian society all the way to the modern day. And perhaps the greatest lasting impact of World War II for Russia was the fact that it absolutely broke the back of the nation's demographic future. As we've already mentioned, World War II cost the lives of over 20 million Soviet people, and actually around 27 million to be exact. And this grim fact has led to a phenomenon in modern Russia known as the missing generation. A group of people who should have existed, but who never did, because the people who would have been their parents, or grandparents, or great-grandparents, died in World War II and never gave birth to their children. If you were a boy born in Russia in 1923, you would have turned 18 in 1941, the year the Eastern Front exploded into full-scale catastrophe, putting you in prime fighting age just in time to be sent to the deadliest theater of war in human history. If you managed to survive combat action, well, congratulations. But your troubles were just beginning. You would then have to contend with widespread famine, disease, and Stalinist repression, which might find you in a gulag as you simultaneously face down widespread famine and disease. If this sounds like a grim picture, it was. So grim, in fact, that for those boys born in Russia in 1923, there was only a 1 in 5 chance of them surviving to their 23rd birthday. Or, in other words, only 20% of Russian boys born in 1923 were still alive by 1946 after World War II had ended. So as a direct result of war and Soviet policies, this generation of Russian men simply disappeared. And so it became that the demographic conditions that would ultimately lead to the rise of the phenomenon of Russian mail-order brides emerged all at the same time. We say that only partially in jest, because mail-order brides really are a long-term effect of World War II on Russian society, and they were hardly the only one, or the most serious. A missing generation of people leads to all sorts of problems, and not just with missing population, but also with social cohesion. For example, even to this day, men in Russia have a very low life expectancy, and we're talking about statistics that came even before Russia started sending their young men to the battlefield in Ukraine, which obviously isn't exactly helping things. The primary reason for this low life expectancy is rampant alcoholism, which causes high rates of death due to health concerns, as well as its ability to lead people to make less than optimal life choices. And according to many sociologists, this rampant alcoholism in the modern day can be traced largely back to the missing generation from World War II. The missing generation, of course, caused many of the young Russian boys who did manage to survive around the World War II era to grow up without fathers. And growing up without a father, especially when it is done on a society-wide scale, can lead to negative social trends that get passed down to each subsequent generation. Young boys without dads can grow up with deficiencies emotionally, practically, and psychologically, causing them in turn to be less than ideal fatherly examples themselves, and on it goes. Individuals aren't doomed to this fate, as they can still make personal choices to go in a different direction, and they often do. But when applied across an entire society, the trend is very real and easy to spot. Once begun, this trend can take several generations to correct, usually 3 to 4 generations, even under ideal conditions. And the conditions in post-World War II Russia have been far from ideal, to say the least. In fact, with Putin's most recent war, he is now restarting these trends just as Russian society finally, at least theoretically, had a generational opportunity to start reversing them. Ironically, the Russians were convinced of the need for the war largely because of their desperate internal demographic situation, the consequences of which were blamed on NATO and the West, who Putin and the Kremlin claimed were intentionally keeping Russians down. This is an example of how societies can, and often do, pursue extremely poor futures for themselves by externalizing the blame for what in reality are internal problems. But in either case, the damage is now done. And all of this contributes to what even Vladimir Putin has previously admitted is Russia's biggest problem: its demographic crisis, which includes this missing generation of men and all the problems it brings, alongside the problems of birth rate, death rate, and negative net migration that we've already mentioned. Since all of these are indisputable facts, it means that Russia is declining in a way that cannot be denied, and that is irreversible, especially with the current decisions Russian leadership has been making. And this does mean that regardless of the outcome of the war in Ukraine, whether Russia wins the war or loses the war, as seems more likely, Russia's state of decline is still going to continue. And in a generation or two, Russia will likely no longer be recognizable as the world power it is, or at least pretends to be, today. So let's look a little bit closer at the three main factors contributing to Russia's inevitable population collapse: the declining birth rate, the rising death rate, and the net immigration, and why it will be so difficult for Russia to escape them. Any of these factors on their own would be a challenge for Russia, but when combined, their effect is amplified exponentially. Let's start with the birth rate, or more formally, the fertility rate. For a fertility rate to be considered at replacement level, it needs to sit at approximately 2.1 births per woman. The idea is that to grow a population, a woman must give birth to enough children to replace herself and her husband, while also accounting for the unfortunate event where some children are lost before they can give birth to children of their own. But in Russia, the fertility rate is not anywhere close to 2.1. Instead, it sits at around 1.5 births per woman. This means that from the get-go, Russia is simply not putting enough new people into its society to replace itself over time. The main reason the population is expected to drop by over 20 million between now and the year 2050. This isn't a secret. As we mentioned earlier, even Vladimir Putin himself admits to this and has called it Russia's biggest problem. In fact, he's even tried to reverse the trend, although extremely unsuccessfully. Some examples have been programs pushed out by the Russian government to incentivize childbirth, like financial payments for families that give birth to new babies. And Russia has also tried to turn motherhood into a patriotic endeavor, with Putin even publicly encouraging all Russian women to start having 8 or more children, despite the fact that he himself only has 2 children that he's been willing to publicly acknowledge. These efforts typically don't work, for obvious reasons. The government incentives are better than nothing, but they typically aren't enough to solve the problems that are preventing people from having children in the first place, and therefore they fail to incentivize people to have more children than they otherwise already would on their own. There are several reasons for a declining birth rate, of course, but typically a major cause is social degradation, where people don't feel as well off as their parents were, leading to a mood among many where they don't desire to bring children into a world that they feel is declining. On a similar note, people who don't feel as well off as their parents were may simply wait until they are older and more established before having children of their own, waiting until they feel financially capable of having a child, and ultimately reducing the total number of births across the society at large. Whatever the case, Putin's incentives have not been able to overcome Russia's problem with the declining birth rate. That in mind, let's turn our attention now to a second factor contributing to Russia's population collapse: the death rate. As we've explored a little bit already, Russia's death rate is extremely high, particularly among young men, who die at twice the rate of Europeans. For Russian men, the average life expectancy is only around 68 years old, which is about 6 years less than men in Bangladesh, a famously extremely poverty-stricken nation that is also prone to heavy natural disasters like hurricanes and mass flooding. And the problem here is that, unlike the birth rate, the Russian government hasn't done much to address the causes for the high death rate. Obviously, Russia is currently pursuing an extremely aggressive war against Ukraine, but that's not actually the main thing we're talking about here. Because as we said earlier, a main contributor to the high death rate among Russian men is alcoholism. And the unfortunate truth is that Russia actually has little incentive to try to solve for this, and arguably, the Russian government even directly contributes to it. In fact, In Russia, there is a long-standing history with alcohol being used as a weapon by the state to control the people. This started all the way back in the days of the Russian Empire, when vodka was one of the only mass-produced items in all of Russia. This was because the Russian czars actually subsidized vodka production to ensure that vodka could be acquired by every citizen at an affordable price. The idea was that if Russian men were constantly drunk and addicted to vodka, they would complain less about their dire serfdom and have less incentive and ability to rise up in revolt, with their continued serf labor more than compensating the empire for the cost of subsidizing their vodka. Russian men got access to cheap drink, while the Russian state got literally everything else. During the Russian Revolution, vodka was correctly identified explicitly as a weapon of the state used to keep the people down. It was actually banned across the country for a short time, but that was quickly reversed when despotic leaders like Stalin came back into power in Russia and realized vodka's true potential for people like them. Alcohol was then put back into society with force, with famous measures like bottles of vodka being sold without resealable caps, so that people would be encouraged to drink the entire bottle in a single sitting. The Soviet excuse was that it was easier to manufacture caps that couldn't be resealed, but if that was truly the reason, they could always have just sold smaller bottles. Zooming ahead to the modern day, even though he famously is known to not drink himself, except perhaps at special occasions, Vladimir Putin even has his own vodka brand, Putinka Vodka. It's a whole story that we've already covered in depth on this channel. The point for this video is that as rampant alcoholism contributes to the high death rate in Russia, Russia as a state has no real incentive to reverse this trend, at least as long as leaders like Putin remain in power, because they actually see it as a benefit, and arguably, for them, it is. With all of this in mind, a declining birth rate combined with an increasing death rate, Russia's only real hope is migration. And that is a big problem for Russia, because on average, far more people move out of the country than are interested in moving into it. This is partially for obvious reasons. Russia as a whole is a poor country with terrible weather, so it's not most people's first choice from the get-go. And Russia has also frequently been described as a cold country, not referring to the weather in this case, but rather to how unfriendly and suspicious the culture tends to be, especially towards outsiders. Just ask any person born in Russia who now lives in Europe or the United States. On top of all of this, Russia is also an ethnic monoculture, with over 70% of the population being ethnically Russian. This type of monoculture would be a major deterrent to immigration in any country, because people typically don't want to move to a country where they will be seen very clearly as an outsider. Immigration is already an uncomfortable situation for people who may not fully know the customs, language, or culture of where they're going, and the way Russia is designed amplifies those problems instead of solving them. In fact, if you dive into Russian political rhetoric, you will not be hard-pressed to find anti-immigration talking points, particularly directed towards China. This is not dissimilar, for example, to the rhetoric you might hear in the United States about immigrants coming over the border from Mexico. There's a very real fear in Russia that China could culturally replace them in Siberia over time, and perhaps even take portions of their land, using the same strategy that Russia has used in places like Georgia and Ukraine. Because of this fear, Russian political rhetoric often explicitly attacks the main population of people that might actually be interested in moving into Russia and helping to alleviate their demographic crisis, making Russia's problem even worse. All of this and more means that there are obvious incentives for people to not want to come into Russia, and at the same time, there are obvious incentives for people to want to leave Russia as well. For example, after their invasion of Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of Russians quickly left the country, both to protect themselves from the war and from the predictable failures that the war could bring to the Russian economy. But those leaving Russia aren't just your average Russian. They are Russians with international passports. And typically speaking, Russians with international passports tend to be the more educated, higher earners in Russian society. There are always exceptions, but we're talking about the overall trends. So as we see people leaving Russian society, they are the ones who would be best equipped to help Russia deal with the problems they will face in the future. This is called a brain drain, and it's not new in Russian history. It happened after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the country lost a huge portion of their most educated people as soon as the doors were open for them to leave. People tend to move towards better opportunities, not worse ones, and that fact also means that those coming into Russia to help stave off this trend, while they may replace some of the population numbers, don't replace the lost population productivity and efficiency, even if the numbers coming in fully replaced those going out, which they don't. Indeed, those migrating into Russia typically come from Central Asia, with few technical skills to speak of, simply looking for a comparatively better place to sell their raw labor. Those then are the three primary factors contributing to Russia's falling population and demographic collapse: fewer babies, more deaths, and a one-way talent exit. That's not something you can build a future on. In fact, it's something that you can hardly maintain the present on. The good news is that this means Russia's current state of warmongering has a time limit. It can't go on forever. But the bad news is that this also means Russia is likely willing to take their war against Ukraine to a level that is far beyond logical, if it could even be considered logical to begin with. The thing to worry about is not what Russia might do in 20 years, but rather what Russia might do today because of what they won't be able to do in 20 years. Indeed, many analysts have highlighted this demographic problem and connected it directly to the war in Ukraine in several ways. Some say that perhaps by invading Ukraine, Putin was giving up on solving Russia's demographic problem through traditional means, and instead was attempting to capture Ukraine and absorb them into the Russian Empire, thereby adding Ukraine's population to Russia's population and improving the demography, at least in terms of raw population numbers. This might seem to make some sense at first. However, the more one examines the psychology of Vladimir Putin, the less likely this seems. Vladimir Putin is simply not the kind of guy who would go into war and risk his power in order to improve his country's demography. Rather, Putin is the kind of guy who might risk making his country's existing demographic crisis even worse in order to gain or keep power. The best explanation, then, for the Kremlin's current behavior seems to be that Putin is attacking Ukraine in a use-them-while-you've-got-them mentality, a last-ditch effort to use Russia's young men while he can in order to capture a portion of his neighbor's territory. In his crude dictator math, there's literally nothing to lose, since he doesn't care about the Ukrainians or even his own soldiers doing the fighting, who in his mind will either cease to exist in Russia's population numbers now if they fall on the battlefield today, or cease to exist in Russia's population numbers tomorrow, in the sense that those filling their age bracket simply won't be born in the next generation. Aside from this, one final explanation might also make sense. Since the demographic crisis has long been seen as the number one problem in Russia, and since Vladimir Putin has failed to solve it, despite being in office for over 20 years, it could very well be the case that Putin has invaded Ukraine to try to draw people's attention towards international opponents rather than focusing on his failures at home. Or it could be a combination of several of these things. When looking at all of this, one of the most important lessons we can learn is that when we are having social problems within our own countries, we should be very alert and very careful that politicians don't begin trying to direct our attention towards external opponents, trying to make us angry at outsiders for all of the perceived problems in our society. This could very well just be a tactic they are using to not solve the problem, but instead to just allow themselves to remain in power a little bit longer. That's part of the reason my channels exist, to help analyze things from the ground up and see if the words of politicians across the globe match the reality. If you appreciate that work, consider subscribing to the channel. And also be sure to check out my second channel, where I post more videos doing exactly this every week. That's all for now. See you on the next video.